Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Wilhelm. I'm Emeritus Professor at the Indiana State University, Scott College of Business. My specialty is business management decision-making and business ethics. In this lecture, you will learn a different set of skills than what you've learned so far. While the previous parts of your coursework concentrated on technical skill development, this portion concentrates on critical thinking skill development, specifically ethical reasoning, which we will apply to technology cases. Well, why study ethics in technology? Well, can you think of any situations in which advanced technology and AI have caused harm in society or treated people unfairly? You probably can. In fact, technology is the field of innovation that most directly affects society today in almost all aspects of our lives. There exists today an ever-present connection and tension between the effects of technologies and our personal and social values. Our social values come from our beliefs in right and wrong, good and bad. These are our ethical beliefs, and they serve as the foundations for the social structures and institutions in our societies. But where do these ethical beliefs come from, and why are they so widely accepted? That's the discussion I would like to engage you in today. This will not be a deep dive into ethical philosophy, but we will wade into the shallow end of that pool. So let's begin. Ethics is about justice in decision making, so we will make some decisions. A trolley is an inner-city transportation vehicle, much like a bus, but it runs on tracks, like a train. The operator can change from one track to another, but he or she cannot steer it like a car or a bus. It goes where the tracks go. Imagine you are the operator of a trolley traveling at a high speed down the tracks, and to your horror, you discover that your brakes are out. As you're speeding down the track, you see up ahead of you 4 workers on the track. At the speed you're traveling, you will hit them and likely kill them, or at best critically injure them. There are steep walls on both sides of the track for many meters in both directions, so there's no way for the workers to get out of the way in time. You will hit them. However, you notice that there is a spur track to the right, just before the 4 workers. You can pull a lever to switch the trolley to the spur track, even though you can't slow it down or stop it. But there's a single worker on the spur track, and he won't be able to get out of the way in time, and you will likely kill him. What decision do you make? Do you pull the lever and switch the trolley to the spur track and likely kill the 1 worker, or not pull the lever and likely kill the 4 workers? If you don't pull the lever, obviously the trolley will kill 4 people. Some of you may choose not to pull because you think that you'll let fate decide the outcome. You may think that since the situation is out of your control, you will not make a decision. However, when faced with a choice and you choose not to choose, that, in fact, is a decision. Most of you will likely judge that the best decision is to pull the lever and kill the 1 worker than to not pull the lever and kill 4 workers. You've done a mental calculation based on the outcomes of the alternative decisions in this situation, and you chose the action that would result in the least harm. You decided to sacrifice 1 worker to save 4. Now let's look at a variation of this scenario. In this situation, you're standing on a footbridge. You can see below you have a trolley speeding down the track and the operator frantically trying to stop the trolley. And you judge correctly that the brakes are out. Again, there are 4 workers on the track ahead of the trolley, and there's no way for the workers to get out of the way in time. The trolley will hit them and likely kill them. In this scenario, however, there is no spur track for the trolley operator to switch to. He's going to run into the 4 workers for certain. As you're watching the situation develop from your position on the bridge, you notice that just next to you is a great big fat guy standing directly over the trolley track. You judge that if you pushed him off the footbridge, he would land right on the trolley track, and he is big enough to stop the trolley, even though he would likely be killed. But you will have saved 4 people by sacrificing 1. Do you push the fat guy off the bridge to save the 4 workers? What would you choose to do? Most of you probably found the idea of pushing the fat guy off the bridge as a repugnant, offensive idea and would not choose to do it. However, some of you might have done the same mental calculation as before and judged that the least harm in this situation would be to push the fat guy off the bridge. In other words, sacrificing one to save many. Some of you may judge that to push the fat man off the bridge is to commit murder. But does that perception change the outcome of the mental calculation of good and harm? Not really. Let's move on to a third variation on the trolley scenario. You're now a trauma surgeon working in a hospital emergency room. In fact, you're the only emergency room surgeon working the emergency room at this time. When the ambulances begin showing up with terribly injured patients from a recent trolley accident. Our one patient is near death because of severe wounds to many parts of his body. 4 other patients are also badly injured, but not as bad as the first fellow. You could work on saving the critically injured man, but the time that it would take to stabilize him from the many injuries that he's sustained would be so long that the other 4 patients would likely succumb to their injuries and die. However, if you devote the time to save the other 4 patients, the critically injured man will surely die. You don't have enough time to save all 5 patients. What will you choose to do? Work to save the one near-death patient and lose the other 4, or work to save the 4 and sacrifice the 1? Well, a few of you may think it best to work to save the one severely injured patient because he's in the most need of help. Most of you probably believe that it would be best to devote your time to save the 4 and allow the one critically injured patient to die, making him as comfortable as possible with pain medication. In fact, this scenario I just described to you is a very common decision that faces trauma surgeons in combat situations in forward operating surgical units. Surgeons or nurses perform triage on a large number of patients coming into the surgical unit to determine the degrees of urgency of the wounds or illnesses to decide the order of treatment. Treatment is given to save the most lives as possible. This again involves a calculation of expected outcomes, and the best expected outcomes in this case, save more lives, is chosen as the correct ethical decision. The calculation of the greatest good and the least harm works again in this scenario. Now let's take the scenario one step further. You're now an organ transplant surgeon working in a hospital when 5 severely injured trolley accident victims arrive. 1 needs a kidney, 1 needs a heart, 1 needs a spleen, 1 needs a lung, 1 needs kidneys. Unfortunately, there are no replacement organs available at the facility and none available at other facilities. These patients will certainly die if their damaged organs aren't replaced soon. Now, it just so happens that a perfectly healthy 32-year-old man with the same blood type as the injured victims is in the next room taking a nap. He arrived for a routine physical exam, but because of all the chaos in the hospital, his physical was put on hold. Now, you could quietly go into the next room and anesthetize the man and harvest enough perfectly good organs to save the 5 injured patients before they died. Wouldn't that be the ethical thing to do? Again, very few of you would choose to do this course of action. Something seems inherently wrong to you to think about killing an innocent human being in order to save others. But again, doesn't the calculation of greatest good and least harm indicate that it indeed is the best decision to create the greatest good? What has happened with these 4 scenarios is that different ethical principles have emerged. One principle did not work in all situations. The calculation of the greatest good and the least harm did not work in the scenario about pushing the fat man off the bridge to stop the trolley, nor did it work when we thought about harvesting the man's organs to save 5 severely injured patients in need of organ replacements. The 2 scenarios where the calculation of greatest good and least harm did work, that is, deciding to turn the trolley onto the spur track and to sacrifice the 1 worker to save the 4, and the emergency room surgeon deciding to work to save the 4 injured patients while allowing the 1 critically injured patient to die, refers to the principle of consequentialist ethics. Consequentialist ethics locates morality in the consequences or outcomes of the act. It is a results-oriented approach that defines ethical behavior by good or bad consequences. Ethical decisions are those that create the greatest amount of good or the least amount of harm. We saw that the calculation of greatest good worked in 2 examples, but not in all 4 situations. The reason we weren't comfortable pushing the fat man off the bridge or harvesting the healthy man's organs to save more people is because something told us that all humans have a right to their lives. Categorical ethics locates morality in certain duties and rights. It is an ethical theory that uses rules or duties, not outcomes, to distinguish right from wrong. Categorical means unambiguously explicit and direct. In other words, all human beings have certain rights that we have a duty to honor, no matter what the calculation of the outcomes shows. Before we discuss the ethical theories, it would be good to define some terms, specifically morals and ethics. Morals refers to the standards of behavior in relation to others by which people are judged, good or bad, right or wrong. Ethics encompasses the system of beliefs that supports a particular view of morality. To help explain morality, consider the example of a person living alone in the desert, isolated from everyone else, never coming in contact with others. He might act in a way that is offensive and crude, vile, demeaning, and stupid, but could he be considered as acting immorally? Not really, because the behavior could not have any impact on others, unless it were to waste water or some other resource needed by travelers in the future. Morals deals with standards of behavior in relation to others. As to the term ethics, when I was a boy, everyone smoked cigarettes. Smoking was prevalent in homes, social settings, in movies, on TV, everywhere. But when scientific studies determined that smoking caused cancer and other severe diseases, and that secondhand smoke did the same to non-smokers, the ethics of smoking changed. It became unethical to light up indoors with others present because of the harm it causes to others. Harming another is the immoral act, while condemning the act as morally wrong is the ethical belief. Let's look at what we mean when we talk about moral behavior. There are 4 components of moral behavior. Moral sensitivity involves the ability to interpret a situation by evaluating how actions would affect those concerned, imagining cause and effect chains of events, and being aware that there is a moral problem when it exists. Moral judgment involves judging which action would be most just in a moral sense in a morally charged situation. Moral motivation deals with the commitment to taking the moral course of action, valuing moral values over other values, and taking personal responsibility for moral outcomes. Moral character involves persisting in a moral task, having the courage to overcome fatigue and temptations, and implementing subroutines that serve a moral good. It is moral sensitivity and moral judgment that this lecture focuses on. Research has shown that moral motivation and moral character are often demonstrated by those who are sensitive to and can judge ethical situations. These are the theories that serve as the foundation for Western ethical analysis. They'll be incorporated into our systematic judgment protocol for ethical decision-making when we get to case analysis. We have utilitarian ethics, we have duty rights ethics, conventional rules and laws, virtue ethics, distributive justice, and care ethics. The first 3 approaches to ethics on this slide are the theories that deal with how we ought to behave. The 4th deals with personal characteristics of excellence, how one should live in general. The 3rd approach, conventional rules and laws, deals with obligations and prohibitions established by society. These came into existence as a result of applying the other evaluative theories to social issues. They became rules and laws because they work for the greater good in society. The last 2 theories on the slide are variations and refinements on the preceding theories, but they're worthy of examining in some detail because both theories have wide acceptance in Western societies. Utilitarian ethical theory is based on the analysis of consequences of an action. The right ethical course of action would be to choose the action that would produce the greatest amount of utility or good and the least amount of harm. The word utility is used to mean general well-being or happiness, and Mill's view is that utility is the consequence of good action. Utility within the context of utilitarianism refers to people performing actions for social utility. By social utility, he means the well-being of many people. The utilitarian principle assumes that we can somehow measure and add the quantities and benefits produced by an action and subtract from them the measured quantities of harm that an action will produce. This calculation determines which action produces the greatest total benefits or the lowest total costs. The decision process involves 1, determining what alternative actions or policies are available for the situation. 2, for each alternative, I must estimate the direct and indirect benefits and costs that the action would produce for each and every stakeholder affected by the action. And 3, the alternative that produces the greatest sum total of utility or good must be chosen. In essence, we ask, does an action produce the greatest good and the least harm for the greatest number of people? So let's see how this theory works with the following example. Someone who is beloved by the entire community goes to the doctor. The person is ill, experiences pain and dysfunction. The doctor performs a series of tests and examinations. The person returns to the doctor's office later to learn the results, the diagnosis, and the prognosis. The doctor is aware that the tests all show that the person has a disease that is incurable and most likely terminal. Even under the most aggressive treatment option, there is a survival rate of less than 10% over 2 years. The doctor is considering what would be the good to tell the person. Should the person know the truth, or should the person be told something else to reduce the harm? Which is better? What would result in the most good? The doctor might calculate that in telling the truth, there will be a great deal of pain and hardly any pleasure at all. The person will be terribly upset, his family will suffer emotionally, and the entire community will suffer. The doctor will be upset in informing the ill person that there's nothing that the doctor can do to alter the situation. The doctor's staff will be upset seeing the person come in for whatever treatment there may be. On the other hand, if the doctor makes up a story concerning the diagnosis and prognosis that is not true, but that gives the ill person time before the illness makes it obvious that the end is near, well, then the results are different. The patient's not upset. The doctor's not upset in seeing the person. The doctor's staff is not upset. The family, friends, and people in the community have some more time with that person to enjoy things instead of being morose and depressed. So the doctor estimates that not telling the patient the bad news will indeed create more good than harm. Doesn't the utilitarian theory support this decision? When one focuses solely on the outcomes of a singular act, such a conclusion may be reached with the utilitarian view. The act utilitarian might calculate that by telling the truth, there will be more pain and hardly any pleasure at all. So the act utilitarian might calculate that the good is to lie. The rule utilitarian, however, would consider what the long-term consequences would be if all doctors were to lie to those who came to them who had life-threatening, incurable illnesses. In other words, what if this kind of decision were made a rule applicable to everyone? The rule utilitarian might calculate that people would no longer be able to trust their doctors, and this would break down the confidence they need for their therapies to be effective. People would stop going to their doctors, and illnesses and diseases would cause greater harm and suffering. The rule utilitarian might calculate that there is far more harm in lying, and so the good is to tell the truth. Evaluating an act by thinking about it in terms of being made a universal rule is the test of good utilitarian analysis. Utilitarian Determinism is an attractive theory for several reasons. It works well for public policy decision making, it's fairly impartial and confirms moral wrongs, and it is efficient. In fact, you use utilitarian theory probably every time you make decisions. But utilitarian theory has problems with measurement of costs and benefits. For example, how do you measure happiness, pain, or sorrow? It has problems with predictability of costs and benefits. How do we know that the estimates of the consequences will actually produce those costs and problems? It also has problems with interpretations of value of costs, benefits, and trade-offs. Is one person's happiness more valuable than another person's happiness if both can't share in their happiness? Is physical happiness more valuable than emotional happiness? What about intellectual happiness? These weaknesses require us to look at other ethical tools as well as utilitarian theory. Duty rights ethics is based on the recognition of individual human rights and our duty to honor those rights. There are certain moral rights that all human beings possess, regardless of any utilitarian benefits. These rights are categorical. That is, they're unambiguously explicit and direct, and they are imperatives. That means they're of vital importance. They're crucial for everyone. German philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that the supreme principle of morality is a principle of human rationality. Kant held that a rational will must be regarded as autonomous or free in the sense of being the author of the law that binds it. This conception of self-governing reason in each person offered Kant decisive grounds for viewing each person as possessed of equal worth and of deserving of equal respect. So the fundamental principle of morality, the categorical imperative, is none other than the law of an autonomous will. Kant categorized the categorical imperative as an objective, rationally necessary and unconditional principle that we must follow despite any natural desires we may have to the contrary. All actions that violate the autonomy of other human beings are therefore immoral by definition. This applies to all human beings, including oneself. Kant described two formulations of the categorical imperative. Kant's first formulation of the categorical imperative stresses that an act is morally correct only if it can be applied to as a universal rule. He said, an action is morally right for a person in a certain situation if and only if the person's reason for carrying out the action is a reason that he or she would be willing to have every person act on in any similar situation. This formulation, in essence, is what we call in Western society the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The first formulation is called the law of universalizability because it argues that if an action is morally right, then it must apply consistently to everyone, including oneself, and that's called reversibility. We should act as if our actions will become a universal law of conduct in all situations and have the same result, that is, moral correctness. Remember when I just talked about the rule utilitarian view of universalizing an act to test its true moral correctness. This is the same perspective by Kant. We must ask, what if everyone did that? For example, giving one's promise to repay a loan with no intention of repaying it could not possibly be made into a universal rule because promises would cease to be meaningful if everyone made them and no one intended to keep them. Promises then would cease to exist. Kant's second formulation states that an action is morally right for a person if, and only if, in performing the action, the person does not use another merely as a means for advancing his or her own interests, but also both respects and develops the other's capacity to choose freely for themselves. This formulation stresses that all people, including oneself, must be treated with inherent dignity and respect, and must not be used merely as a means to accomplish one's own end objectives. Human beings have an equal dignity that sets them apart from things such as tools and machines, and that is incompatible with being manipulated, deceived, or otherwise unwillingly exploited to satisfy the self-interests of another. This argument was based on his doctrine that a rational will must be regarded as autonomous or free, and thereby possessed of equal worth and deserving of equal respect. Treating another as a means to one's own ends or objectives does not preclude us using another to accomplish one's own objectives as long as the other individual is treated with respect and dignity that also advances his or her own ends and objectives. For example, we use people all the time to take actions that advance our own objectives, like employees we hire in our companies. But if we pay them a fair wage for those actions, we are treating them with the respect and the dignity that they deserve as human beings, and are also advancing their objectives as well as our own. So in Kant's view, would it be morally wrong to sell someone something that they did not want or need? The answer is yes, since this approach is solely focused on accomplishing only the objectives of the salesperson and disregards the customer's interest. So we must ask, does an action treat all people with the dignity they deserve as human beings? Like all theories, critics have found problems with Kant. One criticism is that it can be difficult to determine when someone is using another as a means to their own ends. Suppose, for example, that Mrs. Jones, an employer, only pays minimum wage. In the United States, it's like $7.25 an hour, not much. She pays $7.25 an hour to employees and refuses to install safety equipment that they want. Yet she says she is respecting their capacity to freely choose for themselves because she's willing to let them work elsewhere if they choose. Is she then treating them merely as a means or also as ends? Here, Kant's theory is unclear. Sometimes there are conflicting rights. How should rights be balanced against each other when a certain association of people begin to injure others? For example, suppose that COVID anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, in asserting their rights to freedom of expression, mingle with others and spread the disease, thereby denying them their rights to health and well-being. Whose rights should prevail? Sometimes there are conflicts with universalizability and reversibility. Suppose that someone is such an avowed racist that he would accept others being biased against him if he were a member of the minority he hated. Let me tell you a story about a salesman. This was me back in the 1970s. Think I'm kidding? I had a dark afro and a mustache, and my hairline wasn't quite receding like that, guys. But let me tell you a story, a true story about an incident long ago when I was an area manager for Kawasaki motorcycles. My responsibility was to set up dealerships for Kawasaki products, motorcycles, jet skis, snowmobiles, and a broad line of Kawasaki branded accessories and apparel. I traveled the state of Ohio in the United States managing distribution. Of course, I was paid a commission for the merchandise that I sold through my dealer network. The more they bought from my company, the more money I made. Now, each dealer was an independently owned business. My company did not own the dealerships. But dealers had to sign a contract to represent our product lines in their stores. And they had a responsibility to represent all motor products in the Kawasaki product mix that were available. During a visit to a dealer in a small town in southern Ohio, I noticed that there were several models of motorcycles that the dealer did not have in his inventory. The missing models were some of the slower selling models, to be sure. But the dealer was still supposed to have them in inventory and try to sell them. He was, after all, making a lot of money selling the more popular models and making good profits. I had a technique I used that was actually pretty successful at getting dealers to order missing models for their inventory. I'd stroll around their showroom and storage area while completing a sales order form by filling in the missing models from their inventory. The owner and I would usually sit down in the owner's office for a cup of coffee and to talk, and I would eventually push the completed sales order form across the owner's desk and ask gently for his or her signature. In most cases, it worked, but not in this case. Bert, the dealer, was adamant that he was not going to stock those models. He said he couldn't sell them and that he wouldn't order them. I tried several arguments to persuade him to replace the missing models, but my arguments didn't persuade him. So I told him the following. You know, Bert, Marvin Miller, he knew Marvin well since their stores were only about 15 miles apart. I said, Marvin has been trying to convince me to give him a Kawasaki franchise for the last 2 years, and he has a nice showroom for his tractor and lawnmower supply business. If you're not willing to represent the entire Kawasaki line of motorcycles, I might just have to sign him up as a dealer. Then I slid the order form back across the desk for his signature. What do you think he did? Yeah, he signed it. But what did I just do to that dealer? I coerced him. Maybe you could even call it extortion. I threatened him with harm if he did not comply with my will. My action was completely unethical because it was using that dealer for my own selfish ends, ignoring his interests and objectives. I used him to get what I wanted. Instead of pressuring the dealer by threatening to set up another dealer nearby, I should have used my sales abilities to point out the features and benefits to him of stocking the entire line of Kawasaki motorcycles in his store, and also emphasize to him that this was good for my company, so both companies would profit. And that approach didn't work. To change his mind about ordering the missing motorcycles in the line, I should have just told him, think hard about your decision because it's not in compliance with the dealership agreement. And I should have left it at that until the next follow-up visit. The dealer would most likely have complied by ordering the missing products after I left his store, after realizing that it was both in his best interest and ours to do so. Does this type of thing happen often in business? Of course it does. But that does not make it right. We now have two tools for ethical judgment. Which alternative produced the most good and the least harm for the greatest number of individuals? And which alternative respects the rights and the dignity of the stakeholders and can be universally applied? Let's do some checks for your understanding. What is universalizability? It is the practice of evaluating an action by asking what would happen if this action were made a universal rule that applied in all similar situations. What is reversibility? It is the practice of evaluating an action by asking if I would be willing to have the consequences of that action applied to myself. Where is morality located in utilitarian ethics? Morality is located in the consequences of an action. What does Kant mean by the categorical imperative? It means that we have an unambiguously explicit and direct duty to honor the rights and the dignity of every human being. Let's move on to virtue ethics. Virtue ethics focuses on the inherent character of a moral person rather than analysis of specific actions one performs. One's character should be defined by generally desirable dispositions or virtues. Many ethicists have criticized the assumption that actions are the fundamental subject of ethics. Ethics, they argue, should not only look at the kinds of actions an agent ought to perform, but should pay attention to the kind of person an agent ought to be. An agent-based focus on what one ought to be would look carefully at a person's moral character, whether a person's moral character exhibits virtue or vice. Although virtue ethics looks at moral issues from a very different perspective than action-based ethics, it does not follow that the conclusions of virtue ethics will differ from the conclusions of action-based ethics. What utility and rights do from the perspective of action evaluations, virtue ethics does from the perspective of character evaluations. This character-based approach to morality assumes that we acquire virtue through practice. Virtuous people behave morally. A virtue is a trait or quality generally deemed to be morally excellent and thus is valued as a foundation of good moral being. The lack of a virtue is a vice. What distinguishes humans from all other creatures, Aristotle held, is the ability to reason. And so the distinguishing purpose of a human being is to exercise reason in all of its activities. This concept of human reason is very close to Kant's concept of the autonomous free will. Moral virtues, then, are habits that enable a person to live according to reason. A person lives according to reason, Aristotle argued, when the person chooses a reasonable middle ground between going too far and not going far enough in his actions. Moral virtue, then, is a mean between two vices, one of excess and the other of deficiency, and it aims at hitting the mean in the feelings and desires and actions. Aristotle called the mean between two vices the golden mean, but this ethical principle is not exclusive to ancient Greeks. Buddhism calls it the middle way. References in the Quran of Islam call it the middle ground. Let's look at what the mean means between two vices. The virtue is in the middle column, and the vice of excess is in the column on the left, and the vice of deficiency is in the column on the right. Look at courage, for example, the first virtue. An excess of courage would be the vice of recklessness, and the deficiency would be the vice of cowardice. The second virtue, liberality, has an excessive vice of squandering and a deficiency vice of selfishness. Excessiveness, in truth, is the vice of boastfulness, and too little is deception. Next to the bottom is the virtue of friendliness, with its excessive vice of obsequiousness, which means false friendliness. The deficiency is the vice of cantankerousness, which means grumpy and short-tempered. This table is not an exhaustive list of virtues and vices, but it gives you an idea of the concept of the middle way, or the golden mean, a virtue between two vices. Of course, there are objections to virtue ethics. First, it provides less guidance for specific actions in specific situations. In other words, how does one apply virtue ethics to particular problems? Some virtues can be in conflict, for example, pride and modesty. There are disagreements as to what qualities are to be considered virtues. For example, Aristotle and Greek culture held pride as a virtue, whereas Christian theology does not. As to the objection of how does one apply virtue ethics to particular problems, there are simple yet practical questions to apply to help solve problems. The first we call the mother test. Does your choice of an action demonstrate personal dispositions that you, your mother, or others would be proud of? The other simple question is the newspaper test. You ask, does your choice of an action demonstrate personal dispositions that you would be proud of if it were written about on the front page of your local newspaper? In the United States, we commonly refer to this in business circles as the Wall Street Journal test, which is the most widely read business paper in the country. These two simple tests demand us to reflect on the integrity of our decisions by reflecting on our own personal integrity and character. Conventional moral rules are called social mores, are derived from rule utilitarian ethics and rights ethics. Many social mores become our laws because they work within a society to promote the common good. Most laws are ethical, but not always. Many ethical rules for organizations are formalized into codes of ethics or codes of behavior. So here we ask, does an action violate any rules, social mores, codes of behavior, or laws that promote the common good? I should note here that laws and social mores are not the same, and just obeying the law is not the same as being ethical. For example, is it unlawful to commit adultery in Western countries? No, it's not illegal. However, it is considered immoral by most Western societies. Another example, is it illegal to lie, excepting when involved in illegal contracts or under oath? No, it's not illegal, but in most Western societies, it is considered immoral. Now we discuss briefly two variations on the preceding ethical theories, distributive justice and care ethics. Distributive justice deals with the fair and just distribution of benefits and burdens in a society. In all societies, there is generally a scarcity of benefits, such as jobs, food, housing, medical care, and education. On the other hand, there are generally more burdens, such as unpleasant work, substandard housing, health insecurities of various sorts, and not enough people willing to shoulder them. If there were enough goods to satisfy everyone's desires, then conflicts between people would not arise, and distributive justice would not be needed. The fundamental principle of distributive justice is that equals should be treated equally and unequals should be treated unequally. But how are these decisions made? What principles determine similarity and dissimilarity? What principles determine fairness in distribution of benefits and burdens? If you were in charge of establishing fair rules for distributing benefits and burdens in your society, which principles would you choose for example, jobs? Would jobs in your society be allocated based on ability, intelligence, desire, virtue, race, gender, need, willingness, effort, wealth, etc.? What principles would you use to assess taxes, distributing food, or housing, or higher education, or medical care? In societies, it is the controlling ideology that answers these questions about what principles are used to base decisions about the distribution of benefits and burdens in that society. For example, justice as equality is referred to as egalitarianism. It's based on the notion that every person should be given exactly equal shares of a society's or a group's benefits and burdens. All men are created equal. But it has its deficiencies. Do some disadvantaged people need more than an equal share? Do some wealthy and advantaged people need less than an equal share? For example, in my country, when the COVID pandemic hit, it resulted in many people losing their jobs because of shuttered businesses. The government paid equal amounts to every American, but is it just and fair to pay millionaires and billionaires the same sums of money? It's very debatable. Justice based on contribution or merit is called capitalism. According to this ideology, benefits should be distributed according to the value of the contribution that each individual makes. But how do you measure contribution or work effort or productivity? What about those in need, those with significant deficiencies who are not capable of contributing? Capitalism does not have an answer to these criticisms. Justice based on needs and abilities is called socialism. It believes that burdens should be distributed by people's abilities, benefits should be distributed according to people's needs. It's based on the concept that societies should be communities in which benefits and burdens are distributed like a family. The state is the head of that family. But are societies really the same as families? Is it just for the government to determine how jobs would be distributed, or food, or medical care, and other benefits? And what effect does this type of central control have on individual freedom, on individual incentives to work harder, or to be more innovative when all benefits are decided by the government? Justice as freedom is referred to as libertarianism. Burdens and benefits are distributed according to individuals freely choosing to exchange with others the goods each already owns. People should be allowed to keep everything they make and everything they are freely given. All decisions by the individual should be free from coercion, but at what cost to other human rights, to the disadvantaged, to those in need? Libertarianism does not resolve these problems. Justice as fairness was John Rawls' theory. John Rawls was a renowned American political philosopher. His most discussed work is his theory of a just liberal society called justice as fairness. Rawls's theory takes into account political and economic equality, a minimum standard of living, needs, ability, efforts, and freedom. The guiding ideas of justice as fairness are its principles of justice. The first principle of equal liberty protects individual liberties such as the right to vote, freedom of speech and conscience, freedom to hold personal property, and freedom from arbitrary arrest, etc. The principle of equal liberty protecting individual rights is the most important principle in a society, and this takes precedence over all other principles. Only when this principle is assured does a society address the next principle, the difference principle. The difference principle is based on the idea that social and economic benefits must be arranged to improve the position of the most needy in a society. The difference principle applies to the less fortunate in a society unless such improvements would so burden society that they make everyone, including the needy, worse off than before. The difference principle takes precedence over the third principle, the principle of fair equality of opportunity, which states that everyone should be given an equal opportunity to qualify for the more privileged positions in society's institutions. The principle of fair equality of opportunity means that not only is job discrimination immoral, for example, based on race or gender or age, but also that each person must have access to the training and education needed to qualify for the desirable jobs. You can see that these three principles provide a very fair and equitable distribution of benefits and burdens in a society by, number one, ensuring individual rights, number two, protecting the vulnerable and the most needy, and three, ensuring equal opportunities for improving one's position in society. Of course, there are some critics of Rawls' theory. The difference principle ignores the explanations of how people came to be in less advantaged groups. For example, what about scofflaws and vagrants who put themselves into less advantaged positions by their own behavior? The difference principle is not ambition sensitive enough. Some needy people in society might be in that situation because of their own lack of ambition or effort. The theory was developed to handle problems within society and not helpful to individual decision-making involving specific others. How does one apply it to individual decisions? Well, in fact, Rawls's theory was not designed to be used in individual decision-making, but rather in public policy decision-making. However, the principles still offer valuable guidance about fairness and justice for all members of society. Criticisms of Rawls' theory are weak in comparison to the strength of the theory. That's why it has had a large influence on public policy in democratic societies throughout the entire world. We'll talk finally about care ethics and partiality. Carol Gilligan's theory is based on her objection to justice-based ethical theories, based on the understanding that there are relationships with which we are partial. We attend to and respond to the good of particular concrete persons with whom we are in a valuable and close relationship. There exist special concrete relationships of love and caring that can require partiality. Let me give you an example. To illustrate care ethics versus justice ethics, consider a situation where I am standing on a shore of a big lake. Two young women are thrashing in the water a considerable distance from shore and a considerable distance from each other. I'm the only person on the shore who can save just one of them because they are too far apart for me to save both. I know one young lady to be a wonderful mother of two children. She is very caring. She's an excellent human being, full of wonderful potential to accomplish great things that will benefit society. The other young lady she's a real lowlife, disgusting person who isn't nice to anyone, but she is my daughter. My daughter really isn't any one of those things, to be sure. Who do you think I'll save? Am I morally wrong for saving my daughter? That's an example of a concrete person with whom I am in a valuable and close relationship. There are some concerns about care ethics. For example, not all relationships have value. Some may challenge the value of my relationship with my daughter as a valuable relationship. But can I be condemned as being immoral based on that criticism? Demands of caring sometimes conflict with demands of justice. Some may argue that it would have been more just for me to have saved the good person instead of my daughter. But again, can I be condemned as being immoral? Ethics of care can degenerate into unjust favoritism. Think of a young man working hard for a family-run business. A promotion becomes available, and a less deserving family member gets the promotion instead of the more qualified, hardworking young employee. Is nepotism, which is based on family partiality, just and fair? Care ethics does not have answers to these criticisms. However, the advantage of an ethics of care is that it forces us to focus on partiality that our natural instincts tell us is important. Well, those are the vital philosophies that serve as the foundation of Western ethical thought: utilitarian ethics, duty rights ethics, virtue ethics, and conventional moral rules and laws. And we discussed two variations of these theories: distributive justice and care ethics. Of course, there are other ethical philosophies and variations and elaborations, but these are the prominent theories of Western ethics. So, how do we use these theories to make judgments? Well, the same way we make judgments involving non-ethical matters. We look at the situation, assess alternative courses of action, evaluate outcomes and probabilities, and we choose the best course of action. We use specific evaluation tools, such as these economic decision-making tools. We use cost-benefit analysis, feasibility, return on investment. We use future value. We use SWOT analysis, etc. When confronted with ethical dilemmas, we now have ethical decision-making tools in addition to the economic tools. We have utilitarian ethics, duty rights ethics, conventional moral rules and laws, and we have virtue ethics. We systematically ask the following questions, and these I'll also use as checks for your understanding. The first question we ask is, does an action produce the greatest good and the least harm for the greatest number of people? What theory is that? Utilitarian ethics. Does an action treat all people with the dignity they deserve as human beings? What theory is that? Duty rights ethics. Does your choice of an action demonstrate personal dispositions that you and others would be proud of? What theory is that? Virtue ethics. And does an action violate any rules, social mores, codes of behavior, or laws that promote the common good? That, of course, is conventional moral rules and laws. So you now have ethical decision-making tools to use in your judgments. However, before we begin case analysis, we need to learn about several predictable flaws in human judgment. The next lecture, Flaws in Human Judgment, Noise and Bias, is a two-part online lecture that will inform you about human beings are predictably error-prone in reasoning. Is this approach that I talked to you about today to ethical decision-making used throughout the world? Of course not. These are Western ethical ideals, but it is Western beliefs that drive commerce and technology throughout the world. And these ethical approaches to decision-making belong in your decision-making toolbox. So ends this lecture.